So usually in the exam, you have two comment on questions. The first comment on question is probably going to be on elasticity. And the second comment on question is a good chance that it would be on a demand and supply diagram. Okay, so here we have a nice past paper question from January 2011. Assume that the policy of the Maldives president to construct more hotels and guest houses goes ahead. Using a demand and supply diagram, comment on how this might affect the market for holidays in the Maldives. So we know that it's an evaluative question because it's got this term comment on. It's a funny OCR specific term that they use just to mean evaluate. So we've got a nice space left here, you know, for a diagram. It wants you to draw a diagram, and then there's a few lines below this question because it wants you to analyse what has happened in the diagram, what the effect is, and then it wants you to evaluate that. So diagram first then, what do you need to put here? Well, the perfect diagram would have labelled axes, so price and quantity. It would have labelled demand and supply, and it would have labelled original equilibrium and labelled new equilibrium. Now, sometimes the diagram questions get you kind of 3 marks, and sometimes they get you 4 marks. And those are, if it's 4 marks, that's the breakdown of them. Sometimes they don't give marks for labelling the axes, but obviously you always need to do this. Very, very important. One of my teacher colleagues actually shortened or came up with an acronym for this, which is ACE. So axes, curves, equilibriums. These are the things that you need to label. So let's have a look at that mark scheme. I'll just jump ahead there. So here we have the diagram. We've got, we're constructing more hotels and guest houses, we know that the Maldives are able to offer and supply more holidays. So it's a shift outwards of supply because there's more competition in the market, basically. And the effects that we have, we've got our labelled supply curves, we've got a labelled demand, we've got quantity down there, we've got price down there, and we've got P0 moving to P1 and Q0 moving to Q1. I usually label it P1, P2, Q1, Q2, just it doesn't matter which way you label it, but just make sure that you're consistent. And it's saying up to 8 marks for the full question, but 3 marks for the diagram, and it breaks down like that. But some additional information here. So incorrectly labelled axes, no marks at all. So if you don't put price and quantity, although they're not going to give you a mark for labelling them, they're going to take away marks if you do that incorrectly. You can, as an alternative, than doing these dotted lines, put E1, E2 to indicate equilibrium. I personally don't like that approach, so I'd rather you did dotted lines and P1, Q1. No credit for increasing quantity. This is for the analysis part. So diagram's kind of done now, perfect diagram. What do you need to know for the explanation, the analysis? So what you need to do really is state what has shifted. So in our diagram, and you might think, well, it's obvious, I've just drawn a diagram, why do I have to explain? The reason is because if you do get the diagram incorrect, you can still pick up some marks from your analysis, and this does happen. You know, students draw completely wrong diagrams, but their explanation is pretty good. So make sure that you're covering all bases here. So state what's shifted. So in this case, we know that supply has shifted outwards. Supply has increased. State what has happened to the price and make reference to the diagram. So the price would have fallen from P1 to P2, or in this diagram it's P0 to P1. And state what's happened to the equilibrium quantity. So it has increased from Q1 to Q2, or in this diagram they've left off Q0 to Q1. Okay, so up to 2 marks for that analysis then. For example, an increase in the quantity traded, or Q1 to Q2, or quantity demanded and supplied from Q1 to Q2, and a fall in the price. So you're getting some extra marks there. But how do you get those comment on marks? Because that's only actually going to take you up to 5 marks, so there's still 3 marks available for the comment on. Well, here's the mark scheme for comment on. So up to 3 marks, so you're kind of sort of disagreeing with yourself of what you've just said, you know, that the quantity is going to increase and the price is going to drop. So it depends upon the extent of the increase in supply. The increase in supply will take time, so there's going to be a time lag. It depends upon the slope of D, demand, so the price elasticity of demand, and sometimes people put in points about the consumer surplus may increase. So I'm going to take you through what the points that I would make for this type of question, because there's loads of different approaches. But one thing I've not got a slide on, but that's quite specific to this because it's building, anything to do with building. So we've got kind of Maldives president, construct more hotels and guest houses. It takes time. You can't just click your fingers and you've got a new hotel, you've got a new guest house. So this would take time. So there's going to be a little bit of a time lag. So it depends when you're looking at this market for holidays in the Maldives. Is it the day after he's announced this policy, or is it 5 years after? Because it's going to look, the diagram's going to look pretty different if it's 5 years after to the day after. So take that into account whenever there's anything that kind of would involve a long time lag. Okay, so it depends upon the size of the shift. Okay, how many new hotels and guest houses are going to be built? Obviously, the more that are going to be built, the bigger the effect on the price and quantity. To be more specific, the greater the drop in the price and the greater the increase in the equilibrium quantity. So size matters in economics. Also, it depends upon the PED I don't know why I've put PED/YED here, but it depends upon the PED. So whenever you shift supply, the effect depends upon PED. Whenever you shift demand, the effect of the demand on price and quantity depends upon PES. Okay, so it's maybe like the other way around than you'd expect it. So supply is moving out here with a very elastic demand, and we can see that the quantity, the equilibrium quantity, increases by a much bigger amount than it increases when demand is inelastic. But this has a really small effect on the price level. Here, the supply's moved out by the same amount, that's like parallel, same kind of movement that we've had there. But you can see because demand is inelastic, it has a really large effect on the fall in the price, but a small effect on the change in the equilibrium quantity. Okay, this is relevant to this question. These diagrams are not relevant to this question, but just to kind of give you an indication of the type of things that you can talk about. I think this slide's meant to say PD/PES. So we've got elastic supply, so we've got a change in demand, and we've got a relatively larger increase in the quantity, the equilibrium quantity, than the increase in the price here. Here we've got the same, is it the same shift? Same size of shift happening, but we've got a larger increase in the price than in the quantity. So when we're shifting demand, the effect of it on the equilibrium quantity, the equilibrium price, depends upon PES. Okay, now sometimes, not with this question, but sometimes you actually get a diagram question where they're asking you to shift both demand and supply. And this is kind of complicated, and actually the result that you end up with sort of depends upon the diagram that you draw. So there might be someone in the exam, obviously you're not going to be looking at their paper, might be someone in the exam that draws a very different diagram to you, but they're still going to get full marks just like you are, even with different outcomes. So we've got both supply and we've got both demand. On this left-hand diagram, we've got demand and supply increasing. So what's always going to happen in this case is the quantity, the equilibrium quantity, is always going to increase. But the price, in my diagram, it's gone up. But that's only because demand has increased by a greater proportion than supply actually increased. If supply had increased by a greater proportion, the price would have gone down. If they'd have both had a very parallel shift or the same size shift, then the price would have stayed the same. Here, we've got the supply increasing but demand decreasing, and we can see that the price would always fall in this instance. But the quantity, what happens to the quantity, the equilibrium quantity, depends upon the size of the shift in supply and the size of the shift in demand. Here are the other two diagrams. So we've got supply decreasing, we've got demand decreasing, and the quantity in this case is always going to decrease. But what happens to the price depends upon the relative size of those shifts. And here we've got supply decreasing but demand increasing, and here the price is always going to increase in this instance. But what happens to the quantity? I've got my quantity falling, the equilibrium quantity, but that really depends upon the size of the shift. This increase in demand is actually smaller than the decrease in supply, which is why the equilibrium quantity is actually decreased in that instance. Finally, the last type of comment on question that you get related to a diagram could be something looking at producer or consumer surplus. So this was from, I think this was from 2010, summer 2010. So define the term consumer surplus for 2 marks, so just learn your definition for that. And then using a diagram, comment on how the increase in ticket prices might have affected the consumer surplus of EU passengers. So we know if you increase ticket prices, consumer surplus is going to fall. You're going to get a loss in consumer surplus. But how can we make a comment on about that? Well, what does it depend upon? Well, the size of the loss of consumer surplus depends upon how much you increase the price by. So the bigger the increase in price, the more your consumer surplus is going to fall by, the bigger the loss is. The smaller the increase, the smaller the loss. I don't have the marks game there, but you can make a kind of comment on question complete just by thinking about, well, after the things that I've stated, would they always happen, or would it actually depend upon other things? You can even think about, well, what happens if demand was more inelastic here? Maybe we've got more business travellers, so they're less sensitive to a change in price. Like, what happens when the price goes up to kind of the size of the change compared to the size of the change if demand was really elastic? So again, we can say it kind of depends upon PED.